Alright, so yesterday we established that we have all had some kind of exposure to some form of algae before, be it a seaweed wrap that you eat on your sushi or having it brush up uncomfortably against your leg while you're at the beach. Everybody has seen or touched some form of algae in their lives. Now there are two main types of algae. There's microalgae, which is typically a microscopic single-celled organism. It's most typically known for turning water a greenish tint. And macroalgae, which is most commonly seen as things like seaweed, sea lettuce, or kelp. So while all algae fall into one of these two broad categories, there are something like 30,000 to 1 million genetically diverse strains of algae, so there is a lot of it. Now I will begin by talking about microalgae and the future of biofuels. So algae is the third generation of biofuel, the first being corn ethanol, which is an ethanol that is produced by fermenting corn. It is an interesting method. It was a very exciting time in the world of biofuels, but it was quickly abandoned for a few reasons. It takes a lot of land mass to grow enough corn to create a sizable amount of ethanol. And due to things like the 2008 food shortages in Egypt, they kind of realized that maybe using our food source as a fuel source wasn't necessarily the smartest idea anyone's ever had. So the idea, it was just quickly abandoned. However, algae-based biofuels have a lot more benefits to them. Land-based plants, they use upwards of about 95% of the energy that they create, just creating things like their root structures and the structure of the plant that allows the plant to grow and to support itself. It's a pretty inefficient system that land-based plants have. However, algae, it just floats in the water, so it uses next to none of its energy source to support itself. Therefore, you have the capability of producing about 100 times more oil per acre than any land plant can generate. So algae, it's essentially just like a little solar-powered energy factory. It's really cool. Now, algal culture is the term that is referred to for culturing algae in ponds or other resources, and like I said, it has been proven to be a far superior form of producing biofuels. One big reason for this is that there are many land plants that are used for things like biofuels that have a long life cycle, so it can take weeks, months, or even years for them to reach maturity so they can be harvested. However, algae can achieve maturity and have a full life cycle in as little as 1 day. This means it can just be grown and refined into fuel much faster than land-based plants. So, for microalgae, there are three main methods for growing it. The first is the open pond method, the second is the closed pond method, and the third is the biophotoreactor method. So I'll begin by talking about the open pond method. It is the cheapest and the least efficient method that you can use to grow algae. Essentially, you just find some stupid pond on your property that you can't do anything else with, and you just start growing algae in there. A few of the issues come from once the algae starts growing, sunlight can't penetrate down into the water as much. So a deep pond is not nearly as good as a shallow pond, but you still have to agitate the water constantly, usually with some kind of a paddle wheel, in order to get as much sunlight as possible into the water and to the algae. And because of things like evaporation, you also have to feed water into the pond almost constantly. So it's just kind of a pain to do it this way. Now the second method, the closed pond method, it is essentially the exact same method, except you build something like, say, a greenhouse over that pond, and it's a little more artificial, but it gives you a lot more control over the process. So you get a little bit more favorable results for a slightly higher cost. It's still not the most efficient, but it's better. And the third method, which is the biophotoreactor, it is the most expensive by far, but also the most efficient by far method for growing algae. Essentially, you build a series of tubing that's clear so that sunlight can penetrate 360 degrees to get as much of the algae as possible. It allows you to control the pH levels of the water with far more accuracy to get better results, and you can feed oxygen and nutrients into the water as well to really jump up the growth process. So all of these methods, they can grow algae. The issue really comes down to, once the algae's been grown, you have to figure out how to separate the algae from the water. There are a few methods that are used to do this. One is a centrifuge method. That's essentially a salad spinner, but on a big scale. It spins really fast and it forces the algae to the outside and the water stays in the center, and then you can just scoop it out. There's also flocculation, which is figuring out a way to get all the algae to clump up, because remember, it's microscopic. You can't just scoop it up. I mean, you essentially just have a bucket of green water, so you have to get all that algae to clump up so that it can be scooped off the surface of the water. This can be done with chemicals. You can introduce different types of algae that clump naturally. You can aerate the water. It causes all the algae to just float to the surface, and you can kind of skim it off the top. You can combine the methods as well. There's no perfect way to do it yet, so that's kind of a problem. But really what you're looking for is, once the algae is separated from the water, you want to get like an algae paste, a real nice paste that you can squeeze the oil out of the algae with. And once it's squeezed out, the excess material doesn't have to just be thrown away. It can be used as fertilizers. It can feed cattle. There's all kinds of things it can be used for. But really, once you have that oil, it can be refined in current oil refineries, so you don't have to build any new plants to do this. It is a lot less corrosive than your typical kerosene jet fuels, and so you don't have to replace the equipment as often while you're refining as well, because it's not corroding that metal. So it's not a perfect process, but it's getting there. There's ways to do it. There's a lot of benefits for it. There has been a study that was published by the European Commission. It predicted that within the next couple of decades, algae-based biofuels would supply about 10% of the EU's transport fuel needs. That would be a huge step for biofuels and humanity as a whole. For this to happen, however, you would need a pond about 3 times the size of Belgium. That's a little difficult to pull off, so it's not saying that it can't be done, it's just that there are problems we don't have the solutions to yet. But one of the reasons this is so exciting is because algae-based biofuels are a carbon-neutral energy source. That means that the carbon that is pulled out of the air, the CO2 that's pulled out of the air while the algae is growing, is no more than what is emitted when it is burned as, say, a biodiesel. So you get a net zero result. It's really great. Now, there are other tremendous benefits to algae besides just the use as biofuel. Algae could relatively easily be a key factor in solving the world's hunger problems. So algae has been cultivated as food around the globe for thousands of years. The Japanese, the Aztecs, and even the Welsh all have a long history of cultivating different forms of algae for food. The Aztecs ate a type of algae called spirulina. They ate it in little cakes. And the Welsh, they made a paste out of Irish moss that they spread onto bread, and they called that laver bread. So spirulina, it is an amazing form of superfood. The reason for this is that it is just chock full of proteins, omega-3 fatty acids, beta-carotene. It even has more protein than meat. So out of 100 grams, spirulina has 57 grams of protein, while a steak has only 25 grams. So that means that it's just a better source of protein for you than eating a big steak. Steak is even a high iron food, and it only has about 14% of your daily required iron. Spirulina has 156% of your daily required iron. So it's really just a tremendous food. In 2010, even, a scientist based at Wageningen University in Belgium, who, fun fact, their mascot's gotta be the flying tongue twisters, he published findings that suggested that an area about the size of the state of Maryland, shown here in red, if you were to grow sea lettuce on it, could provide enough protein to feed the entire human population. The reason for that is just because algae, it's so quick and easy to grow, and it's a great form of getting a lot of different nutrients. It can even be fermented into a grain alcohol if you're into that sort of thing. So there's just a lot of cool things that can be done with algae. Now there are a few other benefits that I'd like to kind of mention as we come to the close of this. One of those would be to replace soy farms with algae as livestock and fish feed. So if we did this, we would no longer need to do things like wild caught fish. Apparently what they do is they go out and they catch wild fish and they grind those fish up, and then they feed the grinded wild fish to farmed fish in order to get those farmed fish the omega-3 acids that they aren't getting naturally. So if we were to replace soy as fish and livestock feed, it would eliminate the need to catch wild fish in order to get those omega-3s to the farmed fish. Another thing is if we were to replace cattle feed made of soy with cattle feed made from algae, we would no longer need to do things like cut down forests in order to grow soy farms. So it's kind of a win-win to use that as a feed substitute as well. I'd just like to close this out, I guess, by saying that algae, it really does have a very bright future ahead of it. And it could lead to a very bright future for all of humanity. We just can't give up on the research that will lead us there. So next time you go swimming in a lake and see that greenish tint to the water, or maybe see some green goop floating on the surface, just don't get grossed out. Get excited, because you are literally swimming in the miracle of miracle plants. Thanks.